Hello, my name is Janice Fuller and I'm an ecologist and a botanist, and I'm delighted to be here with you in National Biodiversity Week, celebrating our biodiversity, and particularly I'm going to talk about woodlands and the value of woodlands for biodiversity. And I'm in a small woodland at the minute in South Galway near Crockwell Village. And I have a particular interest in woodlands because I just think they're beautiful places to come and visit, but they also have a particularly high biodiversity value. And part of the reason for that is because woodlands are a sort of natural vegetation cover in Ireland. Thousands of years ago, Ireland would have been completely covered with woodland from coast to coast. And they say that a squirrel could have hopped from the east coast to the west coast from branch to branch. This would have been thousands of years ago. Then when the first farmers arrived and started to clear the woodland, resulting in the kind of the open landscape we have today. So the woodland we have in Ireland is really valuable because, as I said, the native woodlands are a natural vegetation cover, and they have a huge value for biodiversity because many of our plants and animals are adapted to live in and around woodland. And I suppose another reason that woodlands have a high biodiversity value is because they have a lot of structure. You know, trees are big, they live for a long time. So there's lots of places for animals to live in and around, up in the canopy, on the trunk, down on the ground floor of the woodland. And obviously in the woodland you have lots of different, not just the trees, you have all the kind of the shrubby layer, you have the herbaceous layer on the bottom. And because trees live for a long time, you know, it's a relatively undisturbed environment compared to outside of the woodland where you have a grassland that's grazed or mowed. So a lot of animals that don't like too much disturbance like to live in woodlands. And you also find plants that don't like being disturbed too much, that reproduce or spread slowly, so they survive well in woodlands. And I particularly like coming to woodlands in springtime and early summer because you get that flush of spring flowers kind of from March onwards. A lot of flowers in woodlands like to flower before the leaves are on the trees, where there's still high light levels. So you get all these lovely spring flowers that come out. Then you start getting the leaves on the trees. There's also glorious bird song in spring as birds are busily making nests and laying eggs and all the rest of it, and the next generation are being born. And then once the leaves are on the trees, you get another flush of flowers, plants that don't really mind the low light level, things like bluebells and other flowers. So there's always something happening in the woodland. Then as we move into kind of autumn, you start getting the autumn colours. There's always something happening in woodlands. They're always changing. And then in wintertime, you can really see the structure of the woodland and kind of the bare bones of the forest. So there's a fabulous place to come and visit and to really immerse yourself in nature and enjoy the sights and sounds that you can find in woodland. There's loads of flowers, as I mentioned. We've got lots of different native trees, and we're going to have a look at a couple in a minute. And then there's lots of mammals, that a lot of our native mammals like to live in woodlands. The red squirrel, the badger, the pine marten, and our bats often like living in and around the edges of woodlands. So they're hugely important for birds, for mammals, for plants. And kind of one of the most abundant types of wildlife that are in woodland we don't generally tend to see. They're underground or kind of buried under the kind of the leaf matter or the dead trees and all the rest of it. And they're the insects. And they're really important because obviously they're food for other wildlife, but many insects break down the beetles and break down the kind of dead plant material, the dead wood, and part of that recycling process. And another layer of biodiversity are the fungi or the mushrooms, which are also part of that recycling network and are hugely abundant. And as I said, underground, most of the time we can't see them unless the fruiting bodies pop up and we can see the mushrooms. So there's layers and layers of biodiversity in woodlands. It's a lot more than the trees. The trees provide the structure, and then there's lots of things that live in and around those trees. So I'm just going to point out some of the trees in this particular woodland. This is what we call a mixed woodland, so there's native and non-native species. It still has huge biodiversity value. Obviously our native woodlands have the highest value, but a lot of these mixed woodlands, this has a lovely beech canopy, which isn't a native tree, but still is a beautiful tree and has lots of value for wildlife. But I'm just going to point out some of the native species. This is hawthorn here, which is more commonly you'd find it in hedgerows. It's our kind of dominant hedgerow species, but it's also a woodland species. It tends to like the damper woodlands, and you'll find it in the brighter patches, maybe not in kind of the deep forest, but it has those lovely lobed leaves. And what I like about hawthorn this time of year, it has just such a profusion of flowers, you know, not so much in the woodland, but on the edge of woodland and in the hedgerows. It has a fantastic display of flowers, which is hugely important for our pollinators. It's one of the most important pollinating plants, you know, that pollinators utilise, and obviously it's hugely important for birds then once the berries form later in the season. There's another species here that's a little harder to see and you mightn't be so familiar with. It's a very sort of discreet tree. It's not that uncommon, but it's harder to spot. It's the spindle, and it likes the really limey soils. It looks a little bit like ash. It's got the simple leaves that are a bit like an ash tree. But the way you'll spot it is in autumn time, because the leaves turn a lovely orangey pink and it has bright pink berries. So it's more common where you have limey soils, but it's not a rare species by any stretch of the imagination, and another beautiful woodland shrub. And adding to the diversity in this particular woodland. And then just the third species I'd like to mention is another one of our natives, is the hazel. Hazel often has lots of stems. It's multi-stemmed, not just a single trunk. These leaves are just opening out, but they're lovely sort of furry leaves. And again, hazel likes the limier soils. You won't find it out in Connemara, but you'll find it in many parts of Galway. I just want to talk about the importance of deadwood in a woodland, which is maybe not what you think when you think about biodiversity, but deadwood is really important component of the woodland biodiversity. It's part of the recycling system, so that when trees die and fall over, the insects, particularly beetles and fungi, bacteria, break down that wood, return those nutrients to the soil. But it also provides a really important habitat for all those insects that like eating deadwood. And again, that's going to provide food for birds and for small mammals. And we've started to get records of woodpecker in Galway, which is very exciting, and they like boring holes in standing dead trees. So some standing deadwood and lying deadwood is very important for supporting biodiversity in a woodland. And modern forestry practices have taken that information on board. So even in commercial woodlands, under the kind of forestry guidance, they're obliged to leave a component of deadwood because it's returning those nutrients to the soil and providing a habitat for those organisms that break down that wood. I just want to have a little look at the woodland floor here. This is just a fantastic little woodland, and from a distance it doesn't look at all that special, but I'm so glad I've come to explore it. Just looking at the woodland floor here, there's a few really beautiful flowers. Hopefully you can see dotted around the purple violets. Violets are a common woodland flower, and they're out around this time of year. They just jump out, they're so beautiful. And we've actually a couple of native violet species that you can find in woodlands. There's also this absolutely beautiful flower, the wood avens here, which is a really nice find. It's just a gorgeous flower. There's a garden variety of it. But this, again, it's just telling me that we're on very limey soils around here. And again, other thing that you can see, hopefully commonly, is there's a lot of ivy on the woodland floor. And I just want to talk a little bit about ivy. Ivy is a woodland plant. It's a native plant, and it's, as I said, it grows in and around woodlands. It's of huge biodiversity value because you know, as you can see, it's evergreen. It's one of our very few native broadleaf evergreens. So in winter time, it's the only green thing more or less in here. So it's very important in providing cover for birds and for mammals. It also flowers very late in the summer, so it's hugely important for pollinating insects. You know, and it is a native woodland plant, so sometimes people feel they should be pulling it out of trees, but really they're doing more harm than good, because in many cases, you know, that it's adding wildlife value to that tree or that woodland. And ivy doesn't kill trees. It's not a parasitic plant, it just lives on trees, and I really think it's a valuable component of the woodland. The other thing that's on the floor of the woodland here is these lovely mosses, you know, and it's just another one of the layers we were talking about earlier. You have your trees and your shrubs and your flowers, your fungi and your beetles. You also have a whole suite of lichens, and many woodlands, particularly in Ireland because we have such a humid climate, are dripping in mosses and liverworts. And again, they're just adding more biodiversity. The more species and habitats you have, the more food and niches there are for wildlife, you know, so they're fantastic. Just going to point out a few more of the woodland flowers. There's really abundance in this particular woodland. There's a very familiar bluebells here, which most people know and are really beautiful. They're not the first woodland flower to come out. They start to come out once you start seeing leaves on the trees. Other ones you mightn't be so familiar with, or you might have spotted similar ones. This is a lovely flower here. It's in the same family as the carrot. It's pignut. And a beautiful simple flower, and it has these very thin feathery leaves. There's another related flower that's a bit trickier to see right down here. It's in the same family as the pignut, the wood sanicle here, another gorgeous flower, and the leaves of the wood anemone. And even though it might be tricky to see all of that, it's just showing in a small space. There's such a diversity of flowers here. We've got mosses underneath, we've got the hogweed here, you know, there's just gorgeous array of flowers. And even if you can't tell them all apart, it's nice when you go in woodlands just to see what you can see how many different types you can spot, or even if you're feeling very ambitious, look at the different types of mosses and if you can spot the differences. And there's great apps out there that can help you identify your plants and particularly your flowers. So another hugely important feature of trees and woodland is their ability to take up carbon from the atmosphere and to lock it up in the form of wood. So as long as trees are alive, they're holding on to that carbon and taking it out of the atmosphere. So they're very important in helping mitigate against the impacts of climate breakdown. And we're all very aware of the situation we're in at the minute, in a biodiversity crisis, and our climate is changing. And there could be serious consequences. So we need to protect what woodland we have. That's hugely important for our biodiversity, hugely important as a natural recreation amenity, and also important in the role of woodlands for carbon sequestration and protecting against climate breakdown. And we also need to increase the amount of woodland we have on the landscape and plant more trees in general, and also more native trees and native woodland. And so something you could do during Biodiversity Week, if you have the space in your garden, think about planting a tree. It's a beautiful addition to your garden. It'll be fantastic for wildlife, and it's also helping improve your carbon footprint and take up carbon out of the atmosphere. We've loads of beautiful native trees and shrubs and other trees to choose from. Just go down to your garden centre and see what will suit your garden and your soils. So I hope you've enjoyed exploring this lovely little woodland in Galway with me during Biodiversity Week.